In December 1900, an isolated lighthouse in the middle of the Atlantic sent a signal no one expected. Not because of something that happened, but because of something that didn't. On the remote Flannan Isles north of Scotland, the lighthouse on Island Moor was supposed to be under the care of 3 experienced men. Trained lighthouse keepers, accustomed to violent storms, endless nights, and months of absolute isolation. Men who knew that sea better than anyone. But something was wrong. A supply ship, delayed for days by bad weather, finally managed to approach the island. From the deck, the crew noticed the first unsettling detail. The lighthouse was operating normally. The light had remained on every night. No malfunction, no distress signal, and yet no one came to greet them. No flag was raised. No response came from the tower. No movement was seen on the island. Only the sound of the wind, the waves crashing against the rocks, and silence. When one of the crew finally climbed the lighthouse steps, the feeling he later described was immediate. Something was deeply wrong. The door was unlocked. The interior was in perfect order. A meal sat unfinished on the table, chairs slightly out of place, as if someone had stood up in a hurry. But there was no one there. The beds were made. The clocks had stopped. 2 of the men's waterproof coats were missing. The third was not, which made no sense. No experienced keeper would go out into a storm without full gear. And yet all 3 were gone. No bodies were found, no signs of struggle, no message left behind. Just a lighthouse that continued to do its job, even after its keepers had vanished. The official report spoke of an accident at sea, an attempt to secure equipment during the storm, a fatal fall. But there was a problem. The details didn't add up, because the lighthouse didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted, as if something had happened too quickly to be explained and too quietly to be heard. And that was only the first question. If the 3 men disappeared together, why did the lighthouse never stop shining? When authorities arrived at the Flannan Isles, the investigation followed protocol. Everything needed a rational explanation. The isolation, the brutal weather, and the long history of maritime accidents seemed to point toward a simple conclusion: a storm-related tragedy. But as the details were examined, that explanation began to unravel. The lighthouse logs showed that routine operations had been carried out normally in the days before the disappearance. The light had remained on without interruption. Equipment was functioning. No serious issues were reported. No calls for help. No emergency signals. The official diary contained strange entries. Not alarming at first glance, but unsettling when read together. One entry described a storm more severe than any before. Another mentioned a lighthouse keeper crying. Days later, a simple note read, "Storm ended, sea calm." And then, nothing. No entry explained why all 3 men would leave the lighthouse together. None justified why only 2 took their coats. None mentioned structural damage serious enough to demand immediate action. The rocks surrounding the island, however, told a different story. Deep marks showed that massive waves had struck areas far above normal sea level. Supply boxes were found smashed. Iron railings were twisted. Something of extreme force had hit the island. Still, it didn't explain everything. Even in extreme conditions, experienced keepers knew never to abandon the lighthouse unless absolutely necessary, and never all at once. The basic rule was clear. Someone always stayed inside to keep the light on. But that rule was broken. No signs of violence, no bodies, no witnesses. The official conclusion stated that the men were likely swept away by the sea while attempting to secure external equipment during the storm. A tragic accident amplified by nature. Yet many details were left unanswered. The prolonged silence before the ship arrived, the interrupted meal, the absence of final messages, and the most disturbing fact of all, the lighthouse continued to operate on its own for days, as if nothing had happened. That was when the case stopped being just an accident at sea and became a question no one could answer. If there was an emergency serious enough to draw all 3 men outside, why did none of them try to return? And what caused them all to disappear without leaving a single human trace behind? As years passed, the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles ceased to be merely an investigative case and became something more unsettling. a space between official explanation and an unanswered truth. Not because conclusions were lacking, but because none felt complete. The accepted version, that the men were swept into the sea during a storm, explains some aspects. It accounts for the damage to the rocks. It justifies the violence of the environment, but it fails to explain human behavior. Experienced keepers would not break basic protocol without extreme reason, nor would they knowingly leave the lighthouse unguarded. Others pointed to psychological pressure. Months of isolation, the constant sound of the ocean, the weight of responsibility and relentless stress may have affected their judgment. One initial mistake, a rushed decision, a moment of shared panic. But even this theory encounters a problem. There were no signs of conflict, disorder, or mental collapse inside the lighthouse. Some believe the disappearance was not simultaneous, that one man went outside first, another followed, and the third, realizing something was wrong, made the worst possible decision by trying to help. A silent chain reaction, sealed by the sea. But what truly haunts this case is not the lack of answers. It's the presence of a scene frozen in time. The table set, the clock stopped, the light still burning, as if life had been interrupted mid-moment without warning. To this day, sailors report an uneasy feeling when passing the Flannan Isles. Not fear exactly, but discomfort, a sense of being watched, as if the empty lighthouse were still performing another function beyond guiding ships. Perhaps the mystery was never about what happened that night. Perhaps the real question is what made three experienced men make the same decision at the same time. Because in places of absolute isolation, it's not always the sea that takes people. Sometimes it's the silence. And when a lighthouse remains lit after everyone is gone, it isn't just illuminating the way for passing ships. It's reminding us that some stories never fade,